Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Mickey. I'm Marketing Director at Empow, and I'm glad to be kicking off this webinar on the topic of bringing noisy IDS tools under control. The webinar will be done by Antony Farrow, who's our field CTO for many years and very experienced and has seen everything there is to see on noisy IDSs. And I'm glad also joining us is PJ. He heads the security team at a large manufacturer, and he'll share with us his experience with noisy IDSs and how they overcame that challenge. Please feel free to write in any questions in the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to answer them afterwards. Additionally, this webinar is recorded, and we will share it with you. Thank you very much. Anthony, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Mickey. Obviously, you don't want to be staring at me all day, so let's get on with it. So from the presentation perspective, we're going to just run through some general kind of basics on IDSs and really go through some history on it and how they've developed and evolved, and really into why we say they're noisy. Not a bad thing, sometimes a bad thing, and sometimes in all circumstances actually a good thing. So we'll go through that. We'll go through like really the action as well in terms of what do we find from the IDSs, what do they help discover, and really how they how they sit in the organization. And obviously we're going to have PJ's case study in terms of he'll describe how the use or the combination of Empow and IDSs, IPSs together and how it's helped their organization. And then last we'll run through a pretty quick demo. As you can see in the agenda, we've not really gone much into our solution, so we'll kind of peel that apart in the demonstration itself. So hopefully that's clear. We'll start off with say a nice little proverb here. This is actually one of Mickey's favorites. So the noisy cow and the milk scenario. We'll leave this hanging, and we'll actually come back to it at the end, just so you see the pluses and the pluses that we can bring out of this noisy cow scenario. Anyway, so straight into it. Let's talk a little bit about the history, where IPSs and IDSs kind of came from. And as I talk through, I'm kind of amalgamating the IDS and IPS as a solution, because pretty much obviously IDSs evolved from the IPSs evolved from the IDS platform. But feel free if you actually have any questions around that. So going back in history, obviously we had the firewalls being the kind of breaker of known traffic, but obviously from an investment perspective, looking further into the attack profile, IDSs were important, or came about pretty much from the antivirus perspective, where AVs at the time were very much signature led. So what evolved from that, from the US Air Force or from the US military, was the ability to be able to look more in depth on traffic that was traversing the firewall and say, what is it that I'm looking for? What type of security events do I want to protect? Do I want to discard? And the angle of which IPSs came from was the same as the angle of AV. It was pretty much from the user, from the host perspective. So their focal point was pretty much from the host. And as you know, early on, or at least as it says here, the focal point was signature based. It was a way of being able to identify packets on the wire based on a specific string, on type of string. So they have evolved later on. Obviously, different types of IPSs we have today, which could be more heuristics based, could be more protocol could be more protocol based, and obviously deviation as well. We have certain types of tools that look for user behavior and deviation from that behavior. So they've kind of expanded in history from that original signature based set. But still today, when you look at most IDSs, IPSs on the market, the core of their functionality is pretty much signature based. So based on that, we'll kind of start to tease that apart and understand more around that. So where they with an IPS, obviously, we're being, say, predominantly signature-based. And as I go through the presentation, by the way, we'll talk about it, not just from a source fire, but also we've got Sericata and other types of appliances we'll mention. So, but here we're looking at pretty much a snore rule. And when you actually piece apart the snore rule, you can see the focal point of really as a writer of this, where it's coming from. Yes, there's a identifiable context in terms of the content string. The content string allows us to be able to identify, obviously, that specific pattern in the network we're looking for. But also, they also look for a fast pattern technique. How can I accelerate those connections, or how can I accelerate the detection of those connections, which are very kind of wide in terms of their pattern focus. And then obviously you could drill right down using kind of pill-based regular expression or regex to look for very kind of specific types of bit strings. Those in themselves have huge performance impacts, right? If you start off with a fast pattern, and even in hardware-based platforms today, we use like silicon to do that, to accelerate that capability. But still, it's still a network comes first. In other words, nobody wants to see a degradation in performance. So the pattern strings themselves become actually quite loose in terms of what they're looking for. So when we talk about more loose in terms of signature patterns, when we talk about looking for a pattern in general, right? You could take a book and hit any number of characters in that book, and you'll find several matching patterns throughout that book, throughout those pages. So when we think about that, when we think about pattern matching, we can think about the location as well where our IPSs sit. So generally, going back historically, we put them behind the firewall as a point of reference to see what's coming into our network, to see what we can safeguard against. So more north-south. So when we're thinking north-south, we're thinking things like drive-by based attacks from an inbound perspective. When we're thinking obviously northbound, what we're thinking south to northbound. So things like obviously command and control and other events. But also, as the product evolved over the years, we started to place them in between different business units, in between different departments. So we're looking more for east-west based kind of attack profiles. So that gives us a wider footprint into the organization, gives us information on lateral movement, brute force, scanning kind of activities, even like network discovery activities and so on. So when we put on piece all those types of detections together, it's a very broad detection. And when we piece all those together with a broad range or a very historic range of signatures, we've got a heavy platform that's got a lot of possibilities for false positives. And when you're going back to the previous slide, when you think about the date, the 1980s, when we started looking at these as a signature platform, that's years and years worth of signature buildup. And what you find, especially in today's appliances, is the very historic signatures on there, very loose written signatures, and some of them are pretty old. So combine all those things together, the north-south, the east-west, the kind of historic, very historic signatures, and even the configuration of those. Do people really tailor them for the applications they have in their network? Do they really look to say, do I have Apache? Am I actually going to discard and filter out the Apache rules on this? And so on. So in that case, you end up with a very noisy footprint. And here's a prime example of this. I'll actually build it from here. I took this from one of our customers. We actually pulled it from the dashboard. You could see the top hit here, the top offender. This peer-to-peer BitTorrent sync actually was not identified at all by BitTorrent. It was rsync traffic. So in itself, like rsync, pretty common traffic protocol inside my network. I've got over 7,000 hits of that. And this before we actually enhance this, and we'll talk about it later, how we enhance this rule, is that we saw 7,000 false positives is quite within 48 hours will fill up your dashboard. That's it's pretty, things like that are reoccurring will pretty quickly deter the eye from reality. As well as deterring the eye, there's a definition of inside that 7,000 in this case. Is there actually a true positive? Is there actually a real occurrence of this trigger? So it's not just the matter of tailoring the appliance in terms of the location filtering out or removing signatures because maybe they have no meaning, or we think that they're actually constantly triggering because they're false. It's the ability to be able to identify the specific ones that actually are used and are triggered in in detection for a larger attack or attack footprint that's happening in the network. And that's the key point here. So, you know, what do the manufacturers say? How, when they say, you know, what are the IDS manufacturers? What are they talking about? How do we, you know, how do we get to the crux of, right, my 7,000 false positives or appear to be false positives? Is there really one in there? What do I do? And if you look here, I just pulled out a couple, actually pulled out the patent itself. And all of them talk about human interaction, the ability to go and look at the response and look at the wider picture around that and say, you know, is it true? You know, am I looking at something that realistically is a false positive or a true positive? What is it that's determining this attack sequence and this falseness? The issue is, even out of that 7,000, am I going to sit and look at all the source test IPs, port and protocol? Am I going to sit and look at, even if I've determined the action of a single event, am I actually looking at the same single event over the 7,000? I've got to drill further, right? I've got to spend a lot of time just investigating those triggers themselves. So, you know, here's actually, I pulled this from one of the industries. You know, what is it that we do? How do we enrich those triggers? How do we actually take that information and say that it is false, or it is, you know, it is something that we need to drill further? And I want to kind of bring your attention to things like the CVE mapping, and obviously understand things like that. That as a product, we do actually automated. We do that mapping. We see that further enrichment, and this will come out in both the demonstration and later on in the slides. But the standard way of being able to detect or look at those vulnerabilities and decide whether they're false, decide whether they're actually whether they're not false, or there's an incorrect detection, but there really is an attack going on, is all determined around both enrichment, the environmentals, and other indicators that are actually surrounding this trigger point, which is more meaningful. So, how do the organizations today, you know, how do we deal with these noisy IDSs? I actually know for fact, both in large enterprises, small to large enterprises, and going all the way up to service providers and carriers, I can talk from experience going back into the early 2000s. I know for sure companies like British Telecom, they had over 115 engineers sat looking at IDS signature triggers alone. That's their job. They sat through each of those signatures, just the triggers, not actually tailoring the configuration or looking at the configuration in context to where the environment was. Literally taking each one, looking at the, you know, source test IP port protocol, what the trigger was, what the wider slightly the wider context was, and determining whether they're going to pass that up. So 115 engineers doesn't exactly scale, and this is when we were talking about BT just on the internal, some of the internal networks, not the whole of British Telecom. We know it's old and large. We have other customers today which we know suffer from this problem, where they will drop ship IPSs into part of their network because they want to find specific types of vulnerabilities, outbound command and control, botnet style activity, things like that that they can want to be able to identify and control against. What they end up doing is creating this massive noise. So I'll hand it over to PJ, and I'll let actually Mickey introduce him first.
So we're happy to have PJ joining us today. PJ heads the security team at a large manufacturing company, and he's going to share with us a short case study of how he and his team dealt with the challenge of noisy IDS tools and with the help of Empow. Take it away, PJ.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Just to give you a little bit of my background, a real simplified version of it, not a resume. I have over 20 years of cybersecurity experience in various industries. So I saw the early days of IDS and IPS, and they can be very noisy. I'm currently a CISO at a multi-million-dollar manufacturing company. We have a smaller cybersecurity team, so we were looking for a product that met our needs. We found Impel ISIM after looking at and trying other products. We experienced over hundreds of thousands of events from just our Suricata IDS. That's not including logs and other ingestion sources into the SIM. We look at a lot of external and east-west traffic. So with a smaller cybersecurity team, we needed a product that can help us cut the grass down so we could see the snakes. We needed solid correlation. We found that solution through Impel. Back to you, Mickey.
Antony, well, thank you very much, PJ. Antony will tell us a little bit about Impel and then share a short demo with you of how we deal with these pesky and noisy IDSs.
Thank you. And we can abstract as well how, you know, we enhance the IDS, we enhance the visibility of it as well. So Impel were founded in 2014, as you can see, pretty much based on artificial intelligence look at the SIM market. The SIMs themselves, I think SIM 101, we can all, or 10, we can all agree was actually a good idea. The ability to take, you know, different events from the dispersed products, tie them together to try and find out what's going on in terms of an overall advanced attack. And we know for sure, you know, we can all speak of many large enterprise or, you know, high-end enterprises have been compromised through either simple techniques or advanced techniques, you know, whether that's phishing or leaving, you know, open ports and open IP, you know, open username and passwords out on the web. So a very simplistic model, but the beginning of version 1.0 was an idea. So what we did, we took a different approach to that market. We're using artificial intelligence at 2 levels. We're using AI to be able to identify the attacks themselves, or at least the intent behind the attack. So what I mean by that is that there's a trigger to an antivirus, there's a trigger to an IPS, right? There's a trigger to all of those devices. But what is the real intent? What is the meaning behind that? Different vendors will give you different responses, especially in the AV world. And even in the IPS world, you get different responses for different string types, right? So it's the ability to be able to understand the intent, it's the ability to be able to enrich that, as we mentioned earlier, the ability to be able to then chain those events together. So we have a software analytics model that from the bottom up allows us to be able to identify and automatically identify and automatically chain these advanced attacks together. So what I'll do is I'll switch over to the demo and then and go through that demonstration, but really show you how the IDS events are actually chained together in there and how they correspond to identifying that advanced attack. Wow. So I'll do a quick refresh just in case while we're talking the username and password time now. So what you're looking at straight off is just the Impel dashboard. It's the front screen. It's actually the health and wealth of the platform. It's given us all of the top kind of hit points in terms of top number of events per second, the number of the plugins themselves, and how many events and so on for those plugins. At the bottom, there's actually the top attacks and top entities. One thing to note that the platform does, it actually concentrates on the entity portion of it. So let me quickly, what I'm going to do is going to just drill down from a user perspective and then show you how inside the product where we've identified attacks and identified attacks including IDS and how we've tied those together. So from moving down into the entity list, what I'm looking at here, and what I mean by entities is like users, like hosts and things like that. You can see on the left-hand side, we have the users themselves or the hosts themselves. In this case, we're looking at hosts. And on the right-hand side, we have a specific bunch of techniques that have been triggered. And here I can already see like anti-scan, command and control, brute force, phishing, and so on. Even command and control network patterns. So I can see here that there's a bunch of tools that have identified these attacks, have identified these triggers. And what we've done is correlated those together. the technique or the security score is associated with the technique. In other words, I don't want just a hit on those techniques. What I want is a basis of how that host or that user is used in that overall attack. So in this case, that gives us the ability to be able to look and identify where those users and those hosts are in the root and the core of that attack. You don't want to spend your time hunting down an event without really understanding where it is in associated with the actual network itself. So in this case, it allows us to drill down to the specific either offender or participator in the attack. So let me kind of just drill down into here. So straight off, when I connect to this user, this host, this corp.host, I can see there's a bunch of techniques that have been, that this host has been a victim towards. So you think about, in this case, this is like phishing, IOC bot, things like that, keyloggers. You could easily think in terms of if it's an outbound, an internet-facing device, things like from my IDSs, I could have like drive-by, things like, you know, cross-site scripting, SQL attacks, things like that on the outside, inbound. And it's good to understand what we're targeted with. It's better to understand what we're exploited against. So in other words, I'm a victim to this because these triggers have happened. As a performer, in this case, we can flick the product to decide or find out what circumstances this device is as a performer. So in other words, from the attacks I was a victim towards, was I breached? Was I compromised? And am I now changing state and becoming a performer for certain types of attacks? So here we can see that it was a performer for those type of attacks. So let's, you know, drill down into one of these, quickly into one of these attacks, and let's look for the, let's do a look for the actual attack and see, and look at it from the overall attack, but also from the IPS IDS perspective. So straight off, when I drill into attack, I'm looking at attack footprint, how that was chained together by NPOW. In other words, the events were received from the different appliances. They came into the system. We identified the techniques behind it, and then we chained them together with cause and effect analytics. So I can wind back my my attack footprint and see what those original attacks were. So if I click on this, I can see here this is a command and control technique. Actually, through further investigation, through automated investigation, the system found a phishing technique, which we'll have a look in a minute. And I can also here see a technique here, which is command and control network patterns. It tells me my IPS IDS actually triggered internally from this IPS IDS internal communication to external command and control side. So he's actually identified that technique. I'll just wind this forward. We'll drill down into that a little bit in a sec. Some of the other things I want to show here, the technique of a keylogger. So pretty much things like AV, in this case, antivirus, whether it's sandbox or antivirus on the host, has been used to identify this. And obviously my IPS IDS has been used to identify this C2 activity from the network patterns. When you think about the combination of just looking, or you think about the noise from the IPSs, going back obviously to what we talked about in the slides, if you draw that out and you look at the, you know, like the false positives we saw from those 7,000 peer-to-peer kind of transactions, this could have been a command and control that could have been just lost in those weeds of other false positives or even flows that look like command and control. So in this case, we've added the ability, or we have the ability to chain those different types of techniques together so that we can draw out the true triggers that the IDS is showing and proving, and chain those together with the other techniques to show that there is a more meaningful identification of those attack profile. So let's drill down into it a little bit. What we're doing here is we're looking at it from the face value of the cause and effect analytics, how we've tied those together. And what we're going to do here now is we're actually going to drill down into the actual trigger it was from. In this case, it was from Palo Alto. We can see that it was a command and control pattern. We can see that it was obviously the attack stage was control that it was based on, and we can see the vendor. So the risk level here is identified. This is all by Palo Alto at this stage. So we're looking at the risk stage level from Palo. We can see the corresponding addressing information, source test IP, port and protocol used. We can obviously see the type of threat specifically to the technique that was identified by Palo. In this case, it's a botnet worm activity. And we can look further, the platform can correlate further the types of threats and techniques that were used, not just, oh, this is a command and control and this is an AV, but very specifically the types of threats that tie this command and control to this AV action. So amongst my IPS noise, if I had to drill down to this level of detail and actually going back through those previous actions that we talked about, being able to research, take CV information, research what the threat name is and the threat type, and being able to take that and look for other indicators of compromise that are happening in the network is an ordeal. There's a lot of network noise there. There's a lot of noise that I've got to draw out that individual attack basis. And even talking about experience from some of our partners, some of our customers, they see hundreds of thousands of events per second, right? One of our customers has got over 100,000 events per second of pure Suricata IDS traffic alone. In that case, identifying this one isolated trigger that was in the mix of all the other triggers is either impossible, or it's going to spend a lot of human resources to be able to do that. So realistically, it's not realistic to sit and have all those people churning through each one of those pinpoints and being able to tie it to something else. It's just not possible. As well as looking at the drawn out information here from the individual vendor, we can actually drill down into the raw data that it came from this. So here's an indication of what we're going to get from the event messages themselves. So think about that from looking at our noisy IDS environment. In this case, our threat vulnerability, we can see what it is, but like Microsoft PRC endpoint, so RPC endpoint kind of mapper. But even like looking at it at this level, it's having a context and an understanding and an awareness of what this indication means. Yes, we can educate ourselves on an individual threat basis, but imagine that on that 100,000 events per second that's being triggered by the IPS, and being able to then take that, understanding that intent, and then being able to map that to the other techniques or the other trigger points that are happening in the network. It's very difficult, if not impossible. So let's draw back up to this kind of just that higher level. And we'll just bring it forward just a couple more clicks so you can see some of the other techniques that are happening. We mentioned the keylogger. So actually we're here. We mentioned C2 activity here. The C2 command and control was actually identified by a reputation feed as well. So not just a single feed, but in terms of my IPS is very generous here of identifying those bit patterns of command and control. Have a look. There's some anti-scan and logging. So things like, further afield, thinking what we mentioned earlier about the footprint where we actually deploy our IPS devices, albeit the noise, things like this, an anti-scan. Obviously my IDS can look on those borders between our different domains, and it's pretty much where we deploy them. We deploy them at the gateway, we deploy them on borders. So it's looking for those kind of lateral movement, those base of attack, whether investigation, in this case, anti-scan looking for investigation, but also the lateral movement, brute force and other types of attacks. It can identify all this. Again, it creates noise. It creates a lot of different types of trigger points, but it's the ability to be able to figure those and calculate those and control and chain those together. Okay. Just drilling this kind of just to the end. Don't want to go through the whole risk chain here. But here, like a abnormal data transfer, this is maybe an NTA tool, or something draw your attention to here, like exfiltration patterns. I know like we talked earlier on about the early days of the IPS IDS. We talked earlier on about, signature mapping. We also mentioned like deviation. We also mentioned some of the, heuristics based and protocol awareness IPSs. So they can show me some level of exfiltration, some level of abstraction in terms of movement of data inside the network. But, combine, if you actually think about deviation in itself as a function, deviation is prone to being very false. So in that case, you see a lot of noise behind that deviation, right? I see a lot of noise. In this case, my IPS is doing the job, but that noise is lost, right? Or at least the noise isn't lost. The event is lost within the noise. Going back to our analogy of our cow, it's like I can't see between all of those different events what is realistic here, and this is what we're doing. We're pulling out all of those events from the noise and being able to key and tie those together based on those intent. So let me just flick back to the presentation. That gives you an idea. We did the demo. So just kind of to highlight the points of what you saw from the demonstration, how that ties back to the IDS and how that ties back to those kind of noisy environments. So what we're actually saying is that before, obviously go through the MPAL bit, we actually like noisy IDSs from our perspective, because our analytics platform needs the ability to have all those different alerts to be able to tie those together. So it's a double-edged sword. If you don't have a platform like MPAL, you don't have an analytics engine or don't have some way of being able to provide that automated research, then your noisy IDS, which is what we found in lots of customers, are a nightmare. They have, as a single platform, credible information, just the inability to pull out that credible information. So what we found from our perspective is the ability to sit on top of that wealth of data and being able to chain those events together. One of the points I want to make out here is, we, in the presentation, in the demonstration, we mentioned other vendors, right? We mentioned different types of security platforms, from antivirus to, antivirus reputation, and so on. One of the things we've noticed, which is very key, is that, and you guys have probably seen it, if you have like a vulnerability assessment tool and you run your vulnerability assessment tool, what do you find from a correlation perspective? Or what do they find? What they do is they probe. And when they find like a open service, open port, a vulnerability, they'll try and exploit that vulnerability. What you'll see in the MPAL platform, from a single source platform as an IDS, you don't only see the exploit itself, you'll see how we chain together the next stage of that. So what do I mean? Say I probe a port, I probe a vulnerability inside like PHP or inside of like Tomcat or something, and I can execute backend services. So now I probe that with my, with my test tool. I find there's a vulnerability. My test tool's next series of actions, if it can execute, say like a script or a script behind in the operating system, then in that case, it's going to drill down and do that. What we find from our IPS is we see each of those stage actions. We see that initial injection, or that initial probing, then we see that injection, and it can chain together and show you all of those different footprints, those different actions, those follow-on, those cause and effect. That's what we mean by cause and effect. Those cause and effect actions of the attack sequence as it's happening. So to do that, you need 2 or 3 main core components, right? You need the ability to be able to understand each of the attacks themselves, which is what we're doing at the artificial intelligence using NLP. And then we need the ability to chain those together, which is what we have at the analytics level. So 2 discrete different levels inside the software that allow us to be able to identify and then chain. And by doing that at a very advanced basis, not just on the actual attacks themselves, but on the metadata of the attack, IP source test, what protocols are used, what type of attacks are used, and then being able to show that in an abstract way that allows you to be able to pinpoint the attacks themselves. So in that case, our IDS engines, in that, you don't necessarily need to tune them to the environment they're in. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? So for example, we went back earlier on and we talked about IDSs and signatures. And I mentioned there's a wealth of signatures in there. And I also mentioned we don't necessarily tailor them to the environment that we're in. We don't tailor them to the types of platforms that we have in there. But when you think about it from an attack footprint, if, for example, I allow all of my, say I've got all of my Microsoft signatures lit, and I'm not a Microsoft shop, I'm a CentOS shop or a, or a Mac shop, and I've got a bunch of Microsoft alerts that are happening. They may be false in nature. They are creating that noise in that IDS, but from an overall attack profile, there is no Microsoft device, so it's not going to go any further. As an engineer, yes, you can look at that, but you've got to now piecemeal the next set of actions together. Inside the platform, it's going to tie together those further actions. In other words, I haven't got a Microsoft device, so there are no further follow-on actions. So it's not going to develop into anything further. Thus, that attack footprint is not going to develop into anything further. So there's no follow-on for that. So tailoring your IDS solution doesn't have to be that painstaking with us, because we'll, through the cause and effect, through obviously identifying those true attack profiles, will show you what is really being advanced, how the attack really is following on, versus what dies at the vine, what dies with the first series of attacks. So with that, we'll open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you very much, PJ. We do have a question here from Joe. So first of all, he says, great session, guys. So thank you, Joe. And the question is, does MPOW coexist with the likes of Darktrace and Vectra, or potentially replace them? And the same question, are vulnerability scanners like Nessus, etc.?
So, yep, so from a Darktrace perspective, yeah, that can give, obviously, if you think about, they don't class themselves necessarily as an IPS IDS, but they're definitely an NTA, network traffic analysis, anomaly kind of base engines. We do work with those. We do. The one things I actually find with like Darktrace that they do extremely well. Darktrace do a very good job of showing north-south, internal to external deviation. I didn't go to this website before and so on. This protocol wasn't used. So we do work with those quite happily. We actually have developed plugins for those. So yeah, they do, and they do work well side by side with things like IPS and IDSs. What was the second part of the question?
So yeah, so does MPOW coexist with the likes of Darktrace and Vectra, or potentially replace them? And the second part was, in the same question, are vulnerability scanners like Nessus, etc.?
So vulnerability scanners, yeah, we can, but what's interesting from a vulnerability scanner is that it's an afterfact, right? It doesn't necessarily mean there is an exploit there. It just means there's a possibility of an exploit, right? As you know. So if you run your vulnerability in Nessus scanner, you show that there's the vulnerability in that PHP, that website. Doesn't mean that there is a vulnerability. So what we can do is combine that with the exploits that are happening live in the network. So say, for example, you did find a vulnerability, it's a wealth of data that could be used if it is an actual attack. So in that case, we can combine them together, but as vulnerability scanners are, it's a possibility, not actual physical action, right? But they are usable.
Okay, so that's the questions we have. We'll be in touch with everyone following this. We'll send you a recording of the webinar. Thank you very much for attending. Anthony, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And PJ, thank you also very much for joining us. We'll see you at the next webinar. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.